April 25th, 2003. We're in the yard outside Congregation on Bethel in Bennington, Vermont, and I'm with Rabbi Howard Cohen. And I think I'll start by asking you to tell me a little bit about your own family background, where you grew up. Go back as far as you like or as you can in terms of your family history.
I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. I left there to go to school at the University of Minnesota. And I migrated to the Northeast in the early 80s to work for the Hurricane Island Outward Bound School. I stayed in New England after working for Outward Bound. I went to rabbinical school in Philadelphia and came back to Vermont, to my present location here in Bennington in 94.
And so you grew up in a Jewish community in St. Louis or somewhere in Missouri?
I did. I grew up at a suburb outside of St. Louis. I had an extended family around me from my mom's side, lots of cousins, and I grew up in a fairly traditional conservative congregation.
How did your family end up in Missouri? Do you know that story?
Yeah, my dad came out to St. Louis to go to Washington University after World War II. My mom was born and raised in St. Louis. My mom's father came to St. Louis because of a relative. When he came over from Russia, he came out to St. Louis because he had a relative living there, and it was a kind of family migration. And I'm sure my mom's my grandmother, my mom's side, also came to St. Louis because there was a relative there initially, and when they came over, and my mom and dad met in St.Louis.
So were both sides of the family Russian originally that you know? I'm not as clear on my dad's side. My dad's parents were born in New York, and when we've talked about this, he didn't remember many details about his grandparents and where they came from. So I suspect that they're Eastern European, probably Russian, but we don't really know that much about their history. So that's not something you grew up hearing about. You didn't grow up hearing about the old country or
no,
on the shtetl, that sort of thing.
No. I'm definitely not on my dad's side, and on my mom's side, my grandfather was about 13 when he came. About 13 when he came to the States, and I think my grandmother might even have been about the same age. So, no, we didn't. We got the stories out of them later in life, but we didn't grow up with, or I didn't grow up with. I say we, my sisters and I, didn't grow up with in the old country these kinds of stories. Now.
Mm-hmm. All right, now I'm sort of putting two and two together, but you mentioned rock climbing before, and then you just talked about the Outward Bound. So I take it that you have you have a rabbinical side and you also have an outdoor side. Am I getting that right?
Somewhere? Yeah. Going into the rabbinate was a second career for me.
Lens cap is
on. Going into the rabbinate was a second career for me. I worked for Outward Bound for 9 years when I decided when I left, and my 10th year with Outward Bound was my 10th season was spread out over my first year of rabbinical school, and it was somewhere around my 7th year working for Outward Bound that I began to give serious thought to career change and the rabbinate. So yeah, I have sort of in that regard parallel interests, which do come together here in this congregational setting, because the community supports a project that I started when I was in school called Burning Bush Adventures, which is Judaism in a wilderness context, and it's a little like a Jewish mini Outward Bound program. So,
well, all right, I'm fascinated by that, because as I told you, my own interest is really in where Judaism and Jewishness and place come together. So maybe I'll ask you some questions that go back in time a little bit. When your initial pull for outdoor activity, did your Jewishness feed into that in any way?
No, not initially. I mean, other than the fact that it was my introduction to outdoor pursuits came through my family. Probably some sort of perverse reaction or rebellion against the citified Jewish experience. My mom was a Girl Scout leader for my older sisters, and that led into. And my dad grew up in Brooklyn, and then moved from there to a small town in New Jersey. But so that probably led to their dragging us on camping trips when I was a kid, and that was my first introduction to doing outdoor things. So, but the combination actually didn't come through. It came about because of text than through like a camp experience per se. I found that when I was working in Outward Bound, there were certain texts that I had studied as a kid in my religious education that kept coming back to me and relating to the work I was doing. And then one day I was actually doing some studying of Native American rituals and traditions, and I found myself daydreaming and wondering about what it would be like to be part of an ancient tradition with ancient rituals. And the proverbial brick fell out of the sky and hit me on the head, and I said, well, I am, and I'm missing something here. And I began to explore the way in which my Jewish education and my advancement of Jewish education fed into the work I was doing as an outdoor educator. But the thing about what I was doing as an outdoor educator was that made it that facilitated the link was that I was much more oriented towards the process side of the work, the people side. It wasn't so much about trying to force the skills of rock climbing or paddling or backpacking into some sort of Jewish framework. It was that I was working with people in a modality, and that was the outdoors, and it was the process and the experience people were going through, and the wisdom of Judaism was apropos to the changes that they were undergoing. Most of the people I worked with at Outward Bound were troubled youth, so there was a lot of transitional stuff going on, a lot of reflection on life and where I'm going with life, and so in that regard, it was that way in which I found the wisdom that I had brought with me from my Jewish education was apropos. And then I started to explore, to notice how many Jews there were doing outdoor education or doing outdoor pursuits, and the gap and the sense of spiritual growth that was happening, but not happening in any kind of Jewish context. And so I started to think more about how to bring them together, and that's kind of how it came about.
What were some of the you mentioned certain texts? I take it from the Torah, maybe, or what comes to mind when you think back to?
Well, there was one of the earliest ones that I remember really alighting on and it's staying with me. Comes from Pirkei Avot, and it's the text that says, translated, it says, "Who is wise?" The answer is the person who learns from all people, or literally, "Who is wise? He that learns from all people." And it was that sense of learning from each person and the sharing that really stuck with me. And then the more I began to open up the text and look for the connections, the more I started to see the way one could read the text, not in a forced way, but one could read in a classic rabbinic fashion, and in an interpretive way, and see that it really did speak to us. The Israelites visit a place called Matan in their wanderings. Matan it means gift. And the text says, if I could get the verse quoted exactly right, it's something like Bamidbar Matan, and it's the phrase. And I'll get the text if you want to see it, but you can read it as, in the wilderness there's a gift, and little things like that began to open up to me. And then I started to discover that there were people who spent whole careers doing nothing but studying the plants of the Bible and wandering around Israel looking for these plants and making these kinds of connections. And most of the characters in the Bible have double meanings, often animals or plant names. And so the closeness to nature is right there. It's just we've been pushed away from it so far over time that so it was that kind of stuff. So.
I mean, I've been in pursuit of this question. I can't go as far back as you can, and it's really only been sort of new to me. But I know, this over the last few months, I've been rereading the Torah and engaging for myself a question, which is, I'm not really qualified to answer, but I think that you would be. Is there something about the land of Israel that makes it more special as land than the top of Mount Equinox? I mean, because as somebody yourself, as somebody who revels in a wilderness experience in America,
Yeah.
I wonder.
It's not the same. No, it's yeah. Have you ever been to Israel?
Yeah, my mother is from Israel, so I have that connection.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, there's something about the physical place of Eretz Yisrael that itself sort of is extraordinary. I mean, truly. And if you try to answer the question, for example, what continent is Israel on? You can't really answer it. You could say Africa, it's partially right. You could say Asia, it's partially right. You could say Europe. And the reality is that Israel sits right at the nexus of the three land masses that make up Europe, Asia, and Africa. So I mean, it really is just sort of like this. Geologically, it's a unique place in that regard, and the history that's there. I mean, it just unfolds, and it's literally the crossroads of the development of world history as we know it. I mean, whether it's not the birthplace of world history. It's not it's not the birthplace of Western history, but it's the crossroads where the East and the West and the South all came together. The landscape is extraordinary too. I mean, it's different. The desert is just it's purifying in a way that these woods are great. You can wander around in them, but they don't have the same kind of soul cleansing. There are places in the United States that have that kind of energy. There's certain places that I've been that have had a feeling of an energy, a place where I know it's.
What places come to mind?
The specific area known as the Boundary Waters of northern Minnesota, for example, the Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge. I mean, they're magical places. There's a very profound sense that you can't live there. You can go there, but you can't live there. So I think that's one of the things that makes a mountaintop, I think, feel special. You can't really live there. You can go there. You can't live there. Israel is surrounded by a lot of places where it's really hard to live. So that adds to it. But as I was raised on Zionism, so I can't really I can't really imagine at this stage a relationship to the land of Israel, to Judaism that isn't influenced by the Zionism, and it's so much a part of what it means to me to have a Jewish awareness, a Jewish consciousness. So yeah, it's different. It's a different landscape. It's a different. There are places you can wander around the hills here in the United States, a lot of places, and you have a sense of like, nobody's ever been here before. You don't get that when you're wandering around, and the opposite. When you're wandering around in the desert or the Golan or the Galil in Israel, you have the sense of like any rock I pick up is going to reveal layers and layers of humanity. And that's a different kind of specialness. So defines place in a different way.
Yeah. Now, does that translate to more? Let's talk in more specifically cultural terms. Does that mean that Jews who live outside Israel, in your view, are in exile, or is it not that simple? I mean, because I've been hearing. I talked to, I'm sure you know of the Rabbi Edelman, he's starting a It's actually going to be an Orthodox farm
Oh, in
Amherst,
Amherst,
outside
yeah.
Amherst. And he was telling me that something that the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, which is that this was the advice was you make Israel where you are. And I had never really thought about it that way before. So anyway, I asked a question before.
No, I don't think that living outside of Israel is, diaspora is an exile, and that one has to strive to make Aliyah. It's way too complicated, and Jews have always lived outside of Israel, and so there's a place for us. No, it's just that it is an important place. It's a special place, and we existed for 2,000 years without being, the sovereign rulers or authority in Israel. And if it should happen again, Judaism will survive and persevere one way or the other. But it is important. It's a special place. It's that's. I mean, I do like the Edelman's answer. You make Israel. Where you are. A colleague of mine years ago wrote her own version of the Birkat HaMazon, the blessing after eating, which there's a verse in the traditional one that talks about longing for going back to Israel. But so she had a line that talked about building Jerusalem in your heart. That same notion of where you are is your place, your special place.
So I'd like to hear a little bit about the burning bush experience that you spoke about, and in particular how you make the outdoor experience a particularly Jewish outdoor experience. What kinds of things do you do that make it that? Make it different from any other.
Yeah, the first thing is simply framing the ordinary experience with a Jewish frame, and the fact that it's called Burning Bush Adventures, Jewish, Judaism in an outdoor context. Just that alone says something to people who are like wanting to do that kind of experience, but are concerned that they have to hide their Jewishness. It'll get in the way. It's not what Jews do, and all of a sudden it's an affirmation. Well, wait, I can. It's done outside of the camp model, and there's ways to do it. So just that alone sets it up as an experience, as a Jewish experience. The fact then that they're being led by someone who is also a rabbi is another level of affirmation that these things aren't alien, and so it's just that those are just two levels of barrier breaking. Then when we're out there, depending on the group that I'm out with, we might do things as structured as have different people lead davening, either traditionally or in some creative way. But the worship, just the regular worshiping service. We'll study text in an informal way. I'll pull out text, and depending on when we do the dog sled trip, we study text related to Jewish views on treatment of animals. When we go, we study about text on sacred space. What makes a place sacred? Does it have to be a certain place? Does it have to have, what's sacred time? So one has this experience like this is like, wow, this is such a wonderful, special place, and so then we'll ask, what makes it special, and we'll ask from a Jewish point of view, and this text says this text says not, things like that. The conversations, the dialogues, the discussions that emerge, the comparisons and contrasts, and contrasting with home life, And I wish, our services could have this kind of, be in a place like this, versus there's not enough, this is too much, that's not enough. I mean, it just allows for a different perspective. It allows for people to have, creates a new opportunity when we stand out there in on a frozen lake, or you're in a canoe in the middle of a huge lake, and you stop and you recite some blessings and have a few moments of meditation, and you say, well, in the Talmud we're taught that you're not supposed to pray in a room that doesn't have a window. And all of a sudden it makes sense. But then you talk about, worshiping objects, and why we cover our eyes when we say the Shema, for example, and we talk about how, is God in things? Are all things in God? And it just sets up for all kinds of conversations that you may not have if you just hired a guide and went out, or depending on who the guide was. So that's how it unfolds. That's pretty much it.
So let's talk a little bit about small town New England. You mentioned that...
By the way, this is the third largest city in Vermont.
That's right, yeah. It's Burlington, Rutland, Bennington.
Yeah.
Brattleboro, fourth.
Brattleboro is fourth, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about big town New England. You mentioned that you were in Maine before you were here.
Yeah.
So, but you're not from rural New England. You grew up in the Midwest, so I'm wondering what your sense of rural New England is culturally, and then on top of that, what it's like to be a Jew and a self-aware and practicing Jew in a rural New England setting.
Complicated questions. By the way, my almost 13-year-old daughter wanted me to tell you that being a Jew in a small town sucks.
Okay, I'm glad
I'm sure, any almost 13-year-old anywhere sucks.
She has for a long time not been satisfied by the quantity of Jewish life experience for her.
Definitely interview some kids. That's amazing.
Yeah. She doesn't understand the proportional mathematics. That is to say, if the total number of Jews around here, relative to the total number of Jews around here, the amount of Jewish life that she's experienced is proportionally astronomical. And when we were just in St. Louis, and she and I were walking back from my parents' synagogue, where she was going on again about how, there were 150 people there, you see, and I said, yes, but that 150 people there represents the same percentage of people that shows up in our shul. They have 500 people in their congregation. I went on to make the case there that if there's 60,000 Jews in St. Louis, which there are approximately, there were probably less than 10% of them in shul that Shabbos, but still the numbers feel more substantial to her. But anyway, you're asking about me, Mike. I can't really speak to the culture of life in general in New England. It's way too complicated to sort out. First of all, in my role as rabbi in serving the Jewish community, I'm dealing with overwhelmingly with people who've moved to New England. Some as recently as a couple of years ago, and some 20 years ago. But they bring with them whatever sensibilities they cultivated wherever they were, and that's a different general kind of orientation to life and society than someone who was born and raised in a New England community. So that it just makes it complicated. So it's hard to know in that regard. It's also, speaking as a Jew, it's my perspective is very different than as a rabbi than it is for just an ordinary person who happens to be Jewish and lives here. So the challenges are different. The needs are different. Most anyone who wants to live in a active, vibrant Jewish community will not choose to live in northern New England unless they have no choice. But if one has a choice, they're just generally not going to choose to do it because it's just not there are not enough Jews in the area to create the critical mass to have that kind of life. But coming in as a rabbi whose job is to stimulate Jewish life, it's a different perspective. So my challenge as a rabbi has been to do that, has to create a Jewish life for people where it's difficult to have one, which is a different challenge than a rabbi who's creating an alternative or a niche community in a larger suburban community or responding to different needs. What I find in general the Jews that I encounter is that they're highly self-actualized people. They're doing what they want to be doing with their life. They're living where they want to be living. They're doing the professions that they want to be doing, and they've made career choices that often have cost them professionally, but have been weighed against the quality of life issues that they're weighing. And self-actualized people are, tend not to have as much need for what religion offers. So it's a different experience.
Where were you in Maine before you came here?
I was in Bethel, Maine, small town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most of my 20s, my Jewish life experience was wherever I moved, the Jewish population doubled. Either went from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2. So I don't know. Your initial questions are about the cultural life of New England and the Jewish life. I guess that sort of addresses that.
Well, I have certain. I speculate sometimes, for instance, about. It's partly a stereotypical notion, but that there is a kind of a New England, a kind of a Yankee mindset and way to be and attitude, and I wonder sometimes, is Jewishness, is Jewish identity commensurate with that or not? Because on some levels maybe they do share certain types of values, and maybe not, or maybe it's just a useless stereotype that isn't even worth thinking about.
Yeah, and in general, I think it's kind of a useless stereotype. Again, it's partly because of the migratory patterns of people. People, in a town like Bennington, you can make some reasonably safe assumptions about people based on things like, if somebody was born and raised in Bennington and still lives in Bennington as an adult, they probably don't have a lot of education. What education they have, they've chosen to not pursue whatever career they could with their education because they opted to stay at home, in their hometown with their family. And for the vast majority of the Jews who live in this area, they've chosen to live in an area far from their family and their family of origin and their the things that they would have grown up with because they wanted a different kind of lifestyle. So in that way, there's big contrasts. Actually, something I've been thinking about maybe relates to this, but
hang on just a second. I'm going to flip the.
I've been thinking about the fact that most adult Jews don't live in the town where they grew up. They pursue their career opportunities elsewhere, and in this community, lots of adults were born and raised here. And the more I'm involved in other aspects outside of the Jewish community, the more I'm meeting people who are living around, grandparents and parents, in the same community. So I've just been wondering what it is about, the Jewish value that has really esteemed career goals versus over family orientation. We've seen the Jewish community has seemed to say extended family is not a value, not a high priority. Pursuing goals and professional goals is more important. So I'm just curious about that in terms of how it plays out.
Yeah. Now, in this, maybe you can tell me a little bit about this congregation. My brief exposure to it, aside from right now, is a little while before you showed up. I was meeting with Amy Jo and her husband
Bob.
Yeah. And and got the sense that at least her family's been here a while, that there really is sort of an old guard, somewhat, and then more recent arrivals. Is that how it plays itself out? And I don't want to put words in her mouth because she didn't say old guard,
Yeah.
but I'm just sort of extrapolating.
There are some. There are different levels of there are different migratory rings, on the tree here in Bennington. There are a couple of families who were born and raised here, and whose parents they're first generation Americans, but their parents came here to Bennington when they were young, when their parents were young. There are some people like that. Lots of those people who are still around like that, or I should say a number of those families, of the small number of families like that, have largely intermarried and have virtually nothing to do with the Jewish community anymore. There are some who still have something to do with the community. But each ring of arrivals sees themselves as the old guard. So the current sort of manifestation of the congregation is such that there are a lot of people who moved into the area in the last 10 to 15 years who've become involved, and the people who might have moved in 15 to 20 years ago are less involved. And overwhelmingly, the single most important demographic factor for that is kids. They were families. The kids moved out, and then the families stepped out of their involvement. Although I had an interesting thing, I noticed an interesting thing when I first came here after the first couple of years. A lot of the people that had been instrumental on the board and the process to bring a rabbi to the community, and I'm the first full-time rabbi the congregation had since 1970. That's when a fellow named Chaim Gross died, and then they had for a period of time they had a series of itinerant and part-time rabbis, one of whom lived here but was a rabbinical student in New York. So I noticed that these people weren't around. They seemed to sort of fade away, and so we were at a board retreat, and I made this observation. I said, well, am I doing something wrong? Have I driven away the people who were involved? And one of them said, oh, absolutely not. You've done what we've been waiting for so long to happen, is that you've brought new people in so that we can let go and let other people do it. So there's been a lot of that kind of, we've held on to, we've done it's our turn, it's your turn kind of stuff. But there are people who were around, who are not very active anymore. But there aren't very many people who were born and raised here. There are very few. As I recall, I don't think Amy Jo was born here.
No, she was. She was when she was 10.
10, is that what it was? Yeah. And she has some other family in the area that I think that brought her here. But yeah, there are some, but most of the families have left the area. The original families have left the area.
Is there again? I'm going to resort to some irresponsible assumptions here, but is there, this being Vermont, is there a palpable countercultural aspect to the Judaism that you see around you here? Because
compared to what?
I assume that, well, compared to your typical suburban congregation.
Yeah, in that regard, we're definitely there's much of what we do is different in terms of the informality, some of the values that we hold as a community in terms of our finances, our inclusiveness with people, things like that. Yeah, I countercultural. I don't know if that's the right word, but definitely. We're definitely not like your typical suburban synagogue. In fact, if you would take a template of what a typical synagogue looks like and put it on top of us, we'd look like we were dead in the water, because we operate very differently, and we are informal. Nobody. I mean, tomorrow, because there's a bar mitzvah, I'll be wearing a tie, but I never wear a tie. I mean, funerals and weddings. That's about it. And people come in, they take their shoes off, and so in that way, it's informal, and the culture is different. We see ourselves. We don't look at ourselves as a subscription or membership driven organization. We need to have members pay dues so we can operate, but we also say, we're it. And if, for anyone who's out here who's Jewish or identifies with the Jewish community, and they end up in the hospital or they need a Jewish service, they're going to come here. And so our mailing list includes more than twice as many people actually have openly said, I'm a member of the congregation, but we find out they're in the area and we include them. And most suburban congregations don't do that. They can't. So it's different in that way. I think I'm not sure if that's because we're a New England community, or whether we just take some Reconstructionist values to an even more sort of liberal or casual degree. But so I'm not sure which comes first in that regard, because we're affiliated with the Reconstructionist movement. But we're a different kind of congregation in that, although it's an old building and it's technically an old congregation, it's actually a brand new congregation. When I was hired in '94, there was very little going on. There was a Jewish community. It had a sense of being organized. It had rabbinical students and done stuff, but its infrastructure and its outreach and its services and its was very much not even in its beginnings forms. It just didn't really exist, and so we're more of an entrepreneurial project in some ways, and that makes us different than. There's an energy that around a startup thing, an entrepreneurial thing. So
now within the town, are you part of? Are there sort of interfaith dialogues going on over whatever it might be, a homeless shelter, something like that? I mean, do you find yourself grouped in among the pastor of the Lutheran Church and the priest in the Catholic Church? I mean, do they call you for these sorts of things, or are you on the fringe? Oh well, if it's an organization in the community that wants something done, they call me. If it's well, the coalition, the homeless coalition, wants me on their board, and it's the Jewish community. I mean, that I have access to is recognized as a community of people who act, who support, who are involved with things happening, and there is a strong desire for there to be a liberal presence in the community, a liberal energy. Although it's not a particularly liberal community, but the clergy force in general is pretty conservative, to the point of being largely fundamentalist. So that's important to community members who want to have a clergy presence on any kind of at any level, whether it's a board of a business association or a hospital association, where they want someone who values pluralism, and who's going to bring a religious voice and presence, but not shove it down your throat with a certain kind. So we have an interfaith council that meets monthly, and I'm an active participant in that. But in general, I am part of the community. I think my personality makes it easier for ordinary people to relate to me as a person than for a lot of the other clergy. So I was asked to be the chaplain of the fire department after September 11th, and so I'm chaplain of the fire department, which is one, they haven't had a chaplain before anyone, as long as anyone can remember, but
when you ask the local people, who've been around for a while, and they say, the rabbis, the chaplain, the fire department, they can't believe that. I mean, it's because it's the barrier that has been broken. And I don't know if you saw the sign on the door. We're the office for the Food and Fuel Fund here, which is a fund I used to manage for 4 years. It's an emergency crisis fund, and that put me on the front end of dealing with social welfare related crises and emergencies in the community. Basically, anyone who fell through the cracks ended up here. And the way the fund worked, it was a kind of a communal clergy discretionary fund where the various houses of worship funded it. So if you walked down to one of the churches and said, I'm homeless and I need a place to stay, they would send you down to me here. And I just recently turned over the responsibilities to that to a new clergy person in town. But obviously she's working out of our office, so we still have a involvement with that. And that's one of the nice things about being a rabbi in a small town. The what? It's a small city. It's a small city. Yeah, there you go. You got me on that one. The layers between the kind of work I do and the people who make things happen in town are fewer than in a big city. It's easy for me to stop in the CEO of the hospital's office and talk to him if it's be a member of the congregation. But I can also I'm sitting on a board of something where I'm sitting with vice presidents of the local banks, and so it's much easier to have that kind of access. Same with the political leaders. The Secretary of the State of Vermont is a woman that I met at the Conference of Rural Judaism a number of years ago, and so it'd be a lot less likely to live in Massachusetts and be able to call up the Secretary of State's office, and just have that kind of informality. And so those kinds of things are one of the advantages of living in a state like this, in a community like this.
I'll ask you one more question. What's your sense? I mean, I take it your kids attend school out of state. They go to a Jewish school.
They did. They don't anymore, but they do go to a private school out in Williamstown.
What I was going to ask is, what's your sense of the local awareness of Jewishness in the first place? I mean, do people have a clue? In the schools, are kids hearing anything about Purim or Passover or anything like that?
I don't really know in the schools. A lot depends on the kids themselves and how comfortable they are with their Jewishness, how outgoing they are. There has always been a Jewish presence in the Bennington schools for 75 years. The public schools here and in the community at large generally show indifference to anybody's religious practices, whether they're Jewish or otherwise. So I can't say that it's particularly evident that they are indifferent or insensitive to Jewish, the Jewish rhythms, any more than they are to anything else. But every year they schedule tests on Yom Kippur, and I have to contact the superintendent's office and say they did it again. He's like, I can't believe they've done it again. Let me call the principal. And but it's the problem of just being a minority, and so everybody just kind of people just, for better or for worse, they just default to what they know and what's the majority and what's easiest. So I don't know. It's hard to know. And the town is so stratified that it's really hard to know what people know. It's because it's quite amazing that you going back to your issue of place. There are really several cities here that exist in different dimensions, but they exist in the same place, and people literally walk by people in the other city and don't see they don't see the other citizens at all. It just it's as if they're invisible to that dimension. And so from one dimension to the next, it's hard to know how much people know about Judaism and Jewish life, and for that matter, anything. So.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.